I just saw Barbarian in the cinemas. This film is about a woman named Tess who rents an Airbnb only to find out that the house is not what it seems. This is a horror comedy film that forgets the punchline and falls apart into a rather mixed bag. If you want to watch the film under any of these conditions, I would recommend it to you. But if you're hoping for a legitimate horror experience, I'm not sure this is the one. That's all I want to say before we dive into spoilers. I would recommend watching the film without spoiling it for yourself, so come back to this video. Even the trailer hides much of what the movie actually is. Alright, you had your warning. The core ingredient of Barbarian is an attempt to break all of the norms. Structurally, this is a very unconventional film. The first third of the film follows our protagonist Tess as she moves into this Airbnb, which is occupied by a man named Keith who mistakenly has an overlap stay with her. They find a basement underneath the house in which a demented granny and grandpa live who continue to murder Keith in front of Tess. At his death, we hard cut to a man named AJ. The film throws everything it has just set up to the wayside to explore this new character. Eventually, he too ends up at the Airbnb, but it's a long time before that happens. There's another jump cut later in the film where we jarringly land a few decades back to explore the origins of the basement. Any structuring tools like Save the Cat are blatantly disobeyed here to craft a structure so jarring that you could never see any of its jumps coming. The tone of the film, too, is all over the place. It's torn between being a comedy and an actual horror film at all times. Depending on the bit, it leans into either one or even tries to blend the two. The majority of the film is working well enough on some level to keep you engaged. At first, it was the cinematography and the language in which some of the narrative was being presented. Other times, it's the smart story decisions that keep you engaged with good subtext and setups. I even found the bare-bone concepts within the film interesting at points. The idea of this old hag just wanting to have a baby to nurse and call her own was something I hadn't seen before, so it was something I could get behind. You can tell from the presentation that there's a lot of vision in this film. Each section of the film has a specific way it's paced and shot, wholly distinct from the others. But for how much vision there is, I can't help but feel there is no ultimate vision for the entirety of the film that brings everything together. The individual segments tie together too tightly to be divided as anything looser than an anthology, but they contradict each other too much to be called a well-told story. Let's get into some examples of what I'm talking about. Number 1. At the beginning of the film, Keith is presented in a way that makes you think he is the nefarious barbarian suggested by the title. There's no car out front even though he's staying there. He knows more information than he should. He tries his best to keep Tess in the house at all times. He keeps trying to get her to drink suspicious beverages. He has psychotic dreams. He conveniently has a dual-book stay, which should be impossible. It's certainly a satisfying twist when you realize that the film isn't tropey enough for him to actually be the villain. But when you realize none of these setups amount to anything, the logic of it all comes into question. Suddenly his character just makes zero sense. Number 2. Tess is set up to be interviewing for a job as a researcher for a documentary film. At first, this has no real relevance to the story besides her motivation for needing an Airbnb. When the film takes a shift to follow this other character, AJ, he is introduced as someone in the film industry. It's hard to get your audiences to reinvest themselves into your story when forced into a completely separate world, which is why anthologies are often hard to emotionally attach to. This decision to have him be involved in the film industry is a thematic tie that links him to the original protagonist, Tess. I still wasn't sure why the film angle was important yet, but because that was a common tie, I was able to recognize that this was a necessary addition to the film and an intelligent decision, so I was able to re-engage myself. That was a really great story choice that was set up to award your patience and follow the breadcrumbs it was laying out there. When the significance of them both being filmmakers comes to fruition and bears meaning to the story, it will be all the more satisfying for having led you along that journey. However, ultimately there is no point to them being filmmakers. It amounts to nothing. Number 3. There's a theme that this director AJ has been accused of rape on the set of his new pilot. This theme connects him to the old man found in the basement of the Airbnb, for that's what these underground dungeons were originally used for. There isn't much of a reason behind the connecting rape stories here besides the fact that it leads to both of their deaths. Maybe the director thought that this was good commentary on the horrors of sexual abuse and where it will lead you, but ultimately these outcomes are not meaningful or substantive enough answers to me to why this theme was a necessary addition. It feels more coincidental than meaningful to me. I've seen a lot of people saying Barbarian withholds information and challenges the audience for a very long time. It certainly does, but where I disagree with the general consensus is that the patience of the audience is never rewarded with anything other than a half-hearted laugh because it amounts to nothing. It successfully holds your attention thanks to some good setups and narrative devices, but then it slaps you in the face for paying attention by not resolving any of its winding paths into a cohesive vision. The tone of the film is very on the nose. It feels like it always knows it though, because some of the presentation is strong. There are some sections that are addressed head-on as goofy, like one side character who momentarily saves Tess from the granny, claiming that she can't break into his house because he's been safe there for 15 years. But mid-sentence, the granny tears through the wall and proceeds to dismember him graphically. On the flip side, there are elements like Keith's character making zero sense because they are twisted from the original intention. For it being such a bizarre and outrageous film, there's a thread where Tess tries to get some cops to help her, and this thread tries to be very grounded. This is presented very seriously, but it's the most annoying part of the film because there is zero justification for how these cops act within such a ridiculous film. Pick one or the other, silly or serious. The movie really is consistently jarring and hilarious, but to no real end other than being jarring and hilarious. The film is a really fun time. Here's a brief audio clip of my brother and I reacting to what we just saw.
Bro, literally he pushes her off and she goes, I was actually dumbfounded. That was, oh my goodness.
It's just like characters are so stupid.
It's so
He
bad.
just drops the gun and he's like, I can still make it out alive. Heck.
Sweet mercy.
It got genuine reactions out of me. Unfortunately, while most of the time I was laughing with the movie, when I realized that it wasn't pulling it together, I started laughing at the movie. A joke can only be as good as its punchline, and this movie doesn't have one, unless the point was to perfectly avoid having one, which wouldn't surprise me considering how jarring the whole thing is. Either way, this is a shattering mess that contains bits from way too many projects to ever be rebuilt into something cohesive. The way to prove that this joke doesn't have a good punchline is that the joke can only be told once. Every good joke can be retold. There are intentional things done to hook you in a first viewing of this film, but after you know that it amounts to nothing, it will fail to hook you a second time. You will know you are being tricked. This movie will only work for a single viewing because most of its hooks are fraudulent. It is fascinating and enjoyable for a one-time experience, but there's nothing that will make it stand the test of time. It's a really bizarre lesson to be teaching screenwriters, but make sure your film doesn't trick the audience and ruin the rewatchability of your film because of it. If you enjoyed the video, leave it a like and subscribe. Otherwise, leave it a thumbs down so I know to do better next time. Thanks guys, I'll see you later.